Okay, so this is lab one. We're going to talk about the introduction to anatomy and the body organization. So I am going to initially, or first, go through the document, and then I'm going to go through some of the images to see how those images can be used to pose questions uh, as they act as symbols, within the lab of other things. So first thing I'm going to do is go through your lab lesson that you printed out or downloaded. We are sharing our screen. Hold on, let me just switch for a moment. Just to make sure, okay. Okay, so this is the first lab, so I know everyone's getting accustomed to how this is going to be procedurally done. But what we're going to do is have these available for you to review before you actually get to lab, which makes getting through the material in lab a lot easier, a lot faster for you. And if we're still in the COVID restrictions, we can only have 12 people at a time in the lab. And so if we can do some of this ahead of time, then we have plenty of time in the 2 hours and 40 minutes that were allotted to have one group of 12 people come in for an hour and have access to the models and ask questions. And we look at some slides, hour and 15 minutes or so, and then have a break and clean and then have the next group. Hopefully we're no longer doing that. And this will just serve, as a way to review and perform the lab at home and go over these answers and then come into class to look at all the models and maybe take the quiz there, if we're going to be doing quizzes face-to-face at that point. All right, so the first exercise is anatomical position / directional terms. Right? So anterior means toward the front of the body. Posterior means away from the front of the body. So you're going to fill in these answers. Medial means toward midline. Lateral means away from midline. Superior means toward the head. Inferior means away from the head. Proximal and distal are terms generally used on extremities and their relationship to the point of attachment of that extremity to the core of your body. So points on the arm would be relative to the shoulder joint, points on the legs would be relative to the hip joint. So proximal means closer to the point of attachment and distal means further away from the point of attachment. And when we use the fill in the blanks down here, the terms for that, this will make a little more sense. Proximal and distal are not the only pair of terms that can be used on the extremities, but when it comes to kind of going out and back in the direction that blood and lymphatic fluid travels, blood is out as arterial blood and back is venous blood, that's what we're kind of going back, out and back from the point of attachment. Not that you can't use medial and lateral and anterior and posterior, but proximal distal is just talking about that direction, out and back, who's closer and who's farther away from the point of attachment. Deep means away from the surface of the body, and superficial means towards the surface of the body. Okay, so then we scroll down and we get to these statements with a fill in the blank. So you use one of the terms above, and a term can only be used once in the fill in the blank statement. And I will tell you that if you read it backwards with the opposite term, it should make sense as well. So going in a forward direction, I'll give you an example. The wrist is what to the elbow? Well, of course, we start with one of those proximal distals, which is probably the more complex, but we're comparing the wrist to the elbow in anatomical position, all right? So the wrist is distal to the elbow. And if I read it backwards and swap the term, then it should be a true statement as well. The elbow is proximal, closer to the point of attachment, than the wrist is. The wrist is farther away. Okay, so the wrist is distal to the elbow, but the elbow is proximal to the wrist if we read it backwards. All right, the spine is posterior to the stomach. The muscles are deep to the skin. The lungs are superior to the diaphragm. In this direction, you have two lungs, and the diaphragm is between your thoracic cavity and your abdominal pelvic cavity. So the lungs are superior to the diaphragm would be inferior to the lungs. The sternum is anterior to the spine. The knee is proximal to the ankle. The skull is superficial to the brain. The nose is medial to the ears. The shoulders are lateral to the sternum, and the chin is inferior to the nose. Okay, then we get to planes of sections. So again, here we're going to kind of define it like we did the terms above. So the frontal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior sections or portions. They're not going to exactly be equal to one another because we're not mirror images of anatomy to the front of the body as to the back of the body. Otherwise, we'd have two butts, one to the front, one to the back. Right? But it's definitely in this plane that produces an anterior and posterior portion, or sections of the body. Sagittal plane, right through the center here, divides the body into right and left portions or sections. And the transverse plane, like you're cutting down a tree, produces superior and inferior portions or sections. So how might I use that? I know there are images in the images, in the ones that are provided for this first lab. We're going to go through there, and I'm going to tell you, whether I'm going to use those or not, because what you'll learn of those images are just they're study tools. Doesn't include everything you have to know for the lab, but they're basics, and we may use them, those same images, in our particular lessons. We may want you to know more information about that particular model than what's maybe asked of you on there. That's just a basic study tool. And I will say that generally in this COVID environment, we'll probably use most of those images for quizzing or testing purposes if they're going to be online versions. But we're not restricted to those, and you are not limited to just those examples that you're responsible for. You're responsible for really everything in the lab. So this is for you to kind of study ahead of time. This depending on whether you're face-to-face class, which right now I'm zooming for a face-to-face class, you should come into the lab and take a look and see what these models are. But generally, because of the whole COVID restrictions, we will probably use mostly those images for testing purposes. But when we are back-to-back face-to-face full bore without restrictions to seating capacities in our labs, then you will be in there and you will be responsible for everything in there, just to be fair. So how might I ask you a question? Well, I would have it as a fill in the blank statement. The blank plane divides the body into superior and inferior portions or sections. And so you write in there the transverse plane, or select that from a multiple choice or selection. Or I could write the frontal plane divides the body into blank and blank portions or sections. So you'd say anterior, posterior, or anterior and posterior. I'm not going to use models to ask you questions about those planes. You don't hardly even know the organs, and you really don't understand how they sit in the body. So if you don't know where they really reside in the body, how do you know what plane it's in? So I just think they're not questions I want to ask at this time. Let's put it this way. I don't want to say they're poor questions, but I just think this kind of TMI for what we're trying to do as an orientation kind of lab. All right, then we go to body cavities and membranes, organs and organ systems. All right, so we are going to look at different organs, which in the lab are scattered around the room. So I suggest doing a little video of everything around the room. And we had little bins in front of each group of 2 students that had some organs. Not every organ you had to know because we don't have enough. Right, so what we would normally do is look at those organs in front of us, and then I would cut you loose and have you look at the organs in all the different bins around the room, so you have exposure to everything. But also, in addition to that, I would go around the room and I'd take a video of everything that was laid out. If you hadn't been in there, around the periphery of the room, there are lab tables where the windows are and to the front of the lab. And then where you initially come into the lab to the left, right-hand side, there's a counter there with models and things on them. And we put out and labeled everything. We put an arm out there where you could see skin, and it would say integumentary system. And then we put, a kidney out there, said, that's a kidney for the urinary system. And we put all these different organs out there that you have to know. And that way you could just walk around and go, okay, at least that's one example of everything and its name. Then what you do is you identify the organ system and the body cavity associated with each. And where we have one, primary organ system, and then two, body cavity, those terms in bold print are the only answers you are going to use to put in, into these blank spaces. Don't make up something, don't use anything than what that's been provided for you. Some of these are a little borderline for, let's say, um, um, not the organ system, but the organ cavity. It's not really borderline. It's just that when we say body cavity, it means that that organ is uniquely found really in that cavity. But for all intents and purposes, there are a few exceptions. For instance, the large intestine. Not all of the large intestine is really within the peritoneal membranes. Portions of it kind of go out of the membrane and come back in, but 90% of it is found in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So we're going to go with that. So some things, even though they might be in the region, your mid lumbar, lower lumbar area, of the or the upper thoracic area of the abdominal pelvic cavity, doesn't mean it's within the membranes, and what our organs are within the membranes are considered in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And if they're not, they're called with retroperitoneal, which means they're level with it, but they're just kind of to the back of it. But they're in that region, they're just not within this balloon, kind of double layer balloon of serous membranes within the peritoneal cavity. So in any event, the images, when we go through those, we'll be able to see examples of these different organs. All right, but let's fill this out first. So the liver, the gallbladder, the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, they're all the same body system, right? And that is the digestive system, right? So digestive, or digestion, for liver, gallbladder, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, as well as they're all contained in the same body cavity. So what you could do is either write these down individually, you might just abbreviate AP for abdominal pelvic, or maybe you could just, write in diagonally, or obliquely across here, abdominal pelvic, for all those, because all of those are the same system and the same cavity. Then we get to the spleen. Now the spleen, oops, a little gnat floating around here. The spleen functions in the, let me just move up here. Make sure I'm using the right hyphen backslash term for the lymphatic backslash immune. Okay. I couldn't remember if it was immune lymphatic or lymphatic immune. Oh, there's the dog barking again. So lymphatic immune. And what cavity? Abdominal pelvic. Then we have the urinary bladder, urinary system, abdominal pelvic cavity. Then we have the ovary and the uterus, part of the female reproductive system. So reproduction for both, abdominal pelvic cavity for both. The heart, cardiovascular, pericardial cavity. The lungs, respiratory, pleural cavity. The brain, nervous system, cranial cavity. The spinal cord, nervous system, but vertebral cavity. Right, testes, reproductive or reproduction, and body cavity, none. The testes should be outside the body and not contained within the body cavity. Then we have the skin, which is part of the integumentary system, no cavity. Muscular system, no cavity. Arteries and veins, cardiovascular for both, no cavity for both. Now, it's not like we don't have arteries and veins that pass through the cavities, because they do, but they're not restricted to one cavity pretty much exclusively. All right, the pancreas. Pancreas is a dual function organ. That would be digestion and endocrine. Either one is fine. No cavity. It's one of those organs that's found what's called retroperitoneal, so no cavity. The kidneys are part of the urinary system. No cavity. Diaphragm, even though it's a muscular structure, functions in the respiratory system. no cavity. It's between two cavities. And lymph nodes are part of the lymphatic system, lymphatic immune, no cavity. Now let me add, and I always forget this as I'm going through these, is that when it comes to the ovaries and the testes, if you want to put backslash, immune, endocrine system, so you have reproduction, or endocrine system, that's fine by me. They do function in the endocrine system as well because we make hormones, or certain cells there form hormones such as estrogen and progesterone or testosterone. So if you chose something like that, or if it was a fill in the blank and you wrote that, I would accept that. They don't really become functional until adolescence, really, primarily, so it's not like your whole life they're functioning like that, like a pancreas is, but I would accept that. I mean, as long as it's accurate. It's not necessarily encompasses everything exactly. We just want you to start thinking about first identifying all these organs and what system they're in. Generally, what are our cavities? Where do we find certain organs? And that there's always going to be, slightly some exceptions to the rule, like the large intestine. But it's mostly found in the abdominal pelvic cavity, so we're going to go with that. Okay, so we have finished that filling in the answers to our lab exercises, and now we're going to apply it to our images. So I need to, hold on just a minute, I need to refresh that before I try to share it again. So let me, here, there we go. And now I'll go back to the share function and it should pop up, and there it does. So here we go. Now we're going to look at images. And this way I can tell you whether I really use those images or not. Okay, this is using some directional terms, and it says directional term 1. I will tell you what those are. I believe it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this, but I just don't remember if it's the same order I have them paired up, but I will tell you how these terms would be used. Sometimes I rearrange them because it fits the page a little bit better, and that's all. All right, so let me just tell you how these labels here could be used in questions regarding directional terms. So you have an A up here at the top of the head and the B pointing here about the same midline point, but just further down. So if the question said A is what blank to B, we're looking for one of those directional terms. So first what I would do is identify which pair of terms you're using. And this would be superior and inferior. All right. So A is superior to B and B would be inferior to A. You have to read it carefully because you could ask a question either way. A is what to B using that directional term, or B is what to A. So first you go, oh, this is the pair superior, inferior. And once you have that, then you just reread it and you insert the right term, read it again just to make sure, and then you're good to go. Camera over here. Okay. Go to the next one. All right, so here we have an A and a B. This is, even though it's slightly anterior posterior, this is really medial lateral in this direction. Okay, so A is medial to B and B would be lateral to A. Medial lateral. Then we have an arm here, and the same arm we used for skin, or we're going to use for skin. So you have an A and you have a B, right? And more than likely, if you see an arm and a leg, at least for this first quiz, and they're not pointing to like muscle, if you had the skin, like a whole leg and arm, then we're really talking about proximal distal terms, that pair. All right, so we have A would be proximal to B, and B would be farther away, distal to A. B would be farther away from the ultimate point of attachment than A is. So B is distal to A and A is proximal to B. Then we have planes of the body. All right, this just shows you, your sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes. Then we have a little wooden model from the epidermis. You'll see that more in lab 4. All right. And here we're looking at the pair superficial and deep. Right. So you have to picture this. You have to know this is the skin, and the skin, is all around the surface of your body. Right. So A is superficial to B, and B would be deep to A. This goes into planes, like plane 1. I don't use them. That would be the sagittal plane, but I'm not going to ask you questions like that. I said I'd give you a fill in the blank. This is our example of a spinal cord. This is what I use for spinal cord. And this would be in the transverse plane, but again, I'm not going to ask you that. I'm going to give you fill in the blank, but for people who want to know. All right. And this would be the frontal or coronal plane of the stomach. But again, I won't use it for that purpose. I'll just use a stomach for, it's a stomach, digestive system, abdominal pelvic cavity. All right, so now we're going to look at all the organs. Here's a liver. There's other pictures of liver too, but look at the shape of this. It's kind of like, I don't know, a triangle, but kind of like a triangle. Here's another picture of a liver. This is darker. Then on the undersurface, what's called the inferior surface, using directional terms, here's a gallbladder, always color-coded as green. That's the little organ on the undersurface or inferior aspect of the liver, is that gallbladder. Gallbladder. Then we have a stomach. We're looking at the inside of the stomach. All right, then we have the narrow kinked tube. That is a small intestine. Larger diameter tube, large intestine. Right, so then you go, okay, large intestine. What system? What cavity? Every time we look at one of these organs, the liver, what system? What cavity? Gallbladder, what system? What cavity? Stomach, what system? What cavity? Here we have a spleen. Right? What system? What cavity? And here we have a urinary bladder. So I could ask you, identify that organ, urinary bladder. Identify the system, urinary system. Identify the cavity, abdominal pelvic cavity. This, I will tell you, is generally the model we use for most of the time for your male reproduction, which this would be the example of the testes. There is another model shown later in these that I'm not sure if anybody, I don't think I've ever seen it during an exam, but Dr. Brightman just happened to take a picture of that. Right, and here's another urinary bladder. This is the urinary bladder on the female model. Right. Then we have pointing to, technically it's the little white ball here. This is actually part of the uterine tubes, but I think you couldn't get the arrow to stick. But this little white ball here, this is a female genitourinary reproductive model. And this is part of the reproductive system, the uterus and the fallopian tubes and an ovary. And here's the urinary bladder. So here we're looking at an ovary. Here we're looking at a uterus. Here we're looking at a uterus. Here we have a heart. Two different models, which is nice to see different ones here. Right. This looks like a chewy toy for your dog, but no, it's a lung. Okay, lung. There's two of them there. And lungs, there's because these are all from different models that we've accumulated over the years. Some are small lungs, bigger ones, some are that orangey color to it, which are pretty old, and then some of the newer ones are white, and it just depends. These are the brain models that we use now. They're fairly new in the last 6-7 years. That's the brain, nervous system, cranial cavity. This is what I use for spinal cord. All right, you can see the spinal cord is in the center there. You know, and when we look at the nervous system, we're going to identify these areas in white and gray, and then these layers around it and these little yellow portions. I like spinal cord stuff. And then here we have male reproduction. The testes are here. So the reason why I kind of question why he used that is that when he shows this subsequent picture, you also have the penis here. So I'm not sure if he had an arrow on the testes, I think that probably would have been better, but testes, reproduction, no cavity. Here we have a bone from the skeletal system. So skeletal system, no cavity. All right. Here we have skin, which would be the integumentary system. And that's again, no cavity. And then we have muscle here. Maybe muscle on an arm model. Any that red tissue is always muscle. No cavity, muscular system. We have red vessels, right? Red vessels are oxygenated. So on the most part, they're going to be called arteries. At least for now, we're just going to call the red vessels arteries, and the blue vessels veins, both cardiovascular system and no cavity. All right, this is a pancreas. You can tell that this big, whenever you have a model that has this big white duct system within it, looks like a great big white vein. It's a duct, you know, that's the pancreas. No cavity, dual function organ and digestion and endocrine, really from day one. Here we have a kidney, urinary system, no cavity. Here we have those green nodules. Those are lymph nodes, no cavity. And then we have the diaphragm, functions in the respiratory system, no cavity because it's between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. And that's it for the images. All right, so I gave you examples of how those images are going to be used. We went through them all. I told you which ones I really use, which ones I don't. And I think that's really it. If I think of anything else, I'll try to speak of it in Lab 2 in chemistry. All right, good luck. See you in class.